Did you know that the real Kratos from Greek myth is almost unrecognizable compared to the furious, guilt-ridden warrior from the God of War games? And that the ancient version of Kratos is not a tragic figure struggling with inner demons or searching for redemption, but instead a cold and unyielding embodiment of force itself, a being carved from the earliest moments of creation whose very existence reflected the weight and authority of divine command. To understand who Kratos truly was, we must travel far back in time to an age before Olympus gleamed with white marble and golden halls, before Zeus lifted the thunderbolt in defiance of the Titans. Back to an era when the world was still raw and unshaped, when ancient gods roamed across landscapes formed from chaos. In those primordial years, the river goddess Styx, whose waters marked the boundary between life and death, bore children with the Titan Pallas. Their offspring were not gentle spirits or playful divine youths, but embodiments of fundamental concepts that existed long before mankind ever lifted a prayer. Kratos, the personification of force; Bia, the embodiment of violence; Nike, the essence of victory; and Zelus, the spirit of rivalry and relentless pursuit. These four siblings were not born to represent personalities or emotions, but the underlying forces that live beneath every action of gods and mortals alike. When Zeus began his uprising against the Titans in the war known as the Titanomachy, the outcome was far from certain. The Olympians were younger, fewer in number, and lacked the sheer primal power of their Titan ancestors. But Styx, perceiving the tides of destiny more clearly than most, brought her children to Zeus's side early in the war. This decision proved pivotal because Zeus saw in Kratos and his siblings exactly what he needed: unwavering obedience, absolute loyalty, and the ability to carry out orders without hesitation, fear, or pity. As a reward for their allegiance, Zeus appointed them not as rulers or advisors, but as something far more essential: the divine enforcers of Olympus. They were given no throne and no realm of their own, because they themselves were the instruments through which Zeus would shape and maintain his authority over the world. Kratos took to this role with complete acceptance. Unlike the Kratos of the video games, who was constantly at war with himself, tormented by regret and driven by sorrow and violence, the mythological Kratos never questioned his purpose, never doubted his role, and never wavered. He was not a being shaped by trauma or forced to carry the weight of his family's destruction. Instead, he was born from the very idea of force and created for the purpose of ensuring the stability of divine rule. To him, obedience was not submission, but identity. It was not something forced upon him, but something he embodied in every breath. One of the clearest glimpses we have of the true Kratos appears in the ancient tale of Prometheus, the Titan who stole fire from the gods and delivered it to humanity. Fire was a divine gift, a symbol of knowledge and empowerment, and Zeus considered this theft the ultimate betrayal. To punish Prometheus, Zeus did not simply imprison him. He sentenced him to a torment that would echo through the ages, chaining him to a remote mountain where each day a great eagle would tear into his flesh and feast upon his regenerating liver. It was a divine punishment meant to last forever. Most versions of this myth gloss over the details of how Prometheus was chained, simply mentioning that Zeus ordered it so. But in the version told by the playwright Aeschylus, the moment is described with haunting clarity, and Kratos steps into the narrative not as a background presence, but as a force whose influence shapes the entire scene. He and his sister Bia escort Prometheus to the edge of the world where the chains have been prepared. The air is cold, the cliffs are sharp, and the sky itself seems to recoil from the cruelty about to unfold. Hephaestus, the god of the forge, arrives with his tools, but his heart is heavy. He does not want to chain Prometheus, for the Titan was once his friend. He hesitates, lamenting the fate of someone who showed kindness to humanity. But Kratos stands before him, unshaken and unmoved, speaking not with anger or malice, but with an unbreakable certainty that Zeus's will must be carried out regardless of emotion. He reminds Hephaestus that pity is a weakness, that the will of Zeus is unchangeable, and that compassion has no place in the enforcement of divine law. Kratos insists that the chains must be tightened, that the punishment must be absolute, that no sympathy must interfere with the king's judgment. His words do not come from cruelty. They come from a place beyond such mortal concepts, a place where obedience to authority is the highest truth. This portrayal of Kratos reveals the core of his mythological identity. He is not a warrior fighting for glory, nor a hero seeking revenge, nor a father striving to break the cycle of violence. He is the shadow behind the throne of Olympus, the embodiment of the principle that strength, when tied to authority, is absolute and unforgiving. The Kratos of myth is terrifying not because he inflicts suffering, but because he does so without questioning whether suffering is deserved. He represents power without conscience, force without reflection, and loyalty without compromise. In the ancient stories, this made him a figure to be feared, respected, and understood as an essential part of how the gods maintained their control over the world. This stands in extraordinary contrast to the Kratos of the game series, who is driven by grief, rage, regret, and eventually compassion. The game's Kratos is a man shaped by terrible choices and haunted by the memory of the family he destroyed. He rebels against the gods, defies fate, and attempts to escape the path destiny carved for him. He experiences growth, change, and transformation, but the mythological Kratos does not grow or change because he is not meant to. He is static by design, an eternal reminder that power, when separated from empathy, becomes a rigid and unstoppable force. Yet, despite the stark differences, there is a peculiar harmony between the two portrayals. The mythological Kratos represents the raw and unyielding edge of power, the part of authority that does not bend even when it breaks others. The modern Kratos represents what happens when raw force is forced to confront its own consequences. In a strange way, one can almost imagine that the game's Kratos is the ancient Kratos forced into mortality, forced into feeling, forced into the human condition, and forced to reckon with what it means to have once been the embodiment of unthinking obedience. The two versions of Kratos are not opposites, but reflections across time, the original symbol of power, and the modern examination of that power's consequences. In myth, Kratos fades from the narrative after the punishment of Prometheus. He remains a silent presence in the background, appearing occasionally beside Zeus as a reminder that authority is always enforced by strength, and that strength without compassion can be as cold as the iron chains that bound the Titan. He is never granted the depth or the emotional complexity of the heroes and gods whose stories fill the pages of Greek mythology. He is a force, not a character, a warning, not a lesson, a presence, not a journey. And yet this lack of personal story is precisely what makes him so fascinating. He is not loved or hated. He is not praised or condemned. He simply exists as part of the fabric of divine rule. There is an old belief among some scholars of myth that Kratos did not merely stand beside Zeus as an enforcer of divine law, but that he represented the fear that lived in the hearts of gods and mortals alike when confronting the consequences of disobedience. In this interpretation, Kratos is not just the embodiment of force, but the embodiment of the understanding that order requires sacrifice, and that the world of the gods is held together not only by law but by the threat of punishment for defying that law. When ancient storytellers described him as unyielding, unhesitating, and devoid of pity, they were not simply painting a portrait of a merciless deity, but revealing something about the nature of divine authority itself. The presence of Kratos in the myths hints at an older, darker idea that power, in order to keep its throne, must wield force without hesitation. In this sense, Kratos becomes the shadow cast by the throne of Olympus, the reminder that every shining hall and every victorious god rests upon a foundation of ancient fear, discipline, and the willingness to crush rebellion before it can grow. The Greeks understood that power required an edge, and that edge needed a face. Kratos was that face. His mythic silence is its own message, that authority enforced without compassion becomes a thing of stone, and that obedience without thought becomes a mechanism through which cruelty can pass unchecked. When we compare this with the modern Kratos, we find meaning in the contrast. The game gives Kratos what the myth denied him: a heart that breaks, a mind that doubts, and a soul that seeks purpose. The myth leaves Kratos forever standing at the cliff where Prometheus was chained, like a monument to the darker side of power. The game takes that monument and cracks it open, exposing the fragile human inside, asking whether force can ever free itself from the violence it represents. In the silence of ancient mountains, where the cries of Prometheus once echoed across the cliffs, one can almost imagine the cold shape of Kratos standing unmoving as the wind tears past him. In that stillness, in that unbroken obedience, lies the essence of his myth. And in the modern retelling, where Kratos flees from gods and battles his own nature, lies the essence of his humanity. If one imagines the early days of Olympus, with Zeus newly crowned and the Titanarchy's smoke still drifting across the world, it becomes easier to see why Kratos and his siblings were valued so highly. The gods had won their war, but victory alone does not secure a kingdom. The Titans were defeated, but their remnants still roamed the edges of the world, wounded, resentful, and waiting for weakness. Mortals were beginning to take shape, growing bold and curious, and the gifts of the gods were as likely to lead to rebellion as to devotion. In this fragile new order, the Olympians needed more than lightning bolts and storms. They needed a constant reminder of their authority, a presence so unwavering that even the thought of defiance would crumble at its feet. Kratos provided that presence. When he stood beside Zeus, the other gods were reminded that strength without doubt guarded their reign. When he walked through the great halls, his heavy steps spoke of consequences too severe to ignore. And when he watched the world from the heights of Olympus, he did so not as a protector, but as the cold assurance that the rule of the gods would hold, no matter the cost. To Kratos, to symbols, one ancient and unchanging, one evolving and burdened with the consequences of power. Together, they tell a story about strength, obedience, and the price of force when it stands alone. Please like and subscribe for more mythology content.